So if you think about how we realize dreams, we do so sort of as experimentalists in a lab. And so students here at Harvard University often come to the university sort of dreaming to change the world in some way and are experimenting every semester that they sort of choose a course sort of outline for their semester. And at the end of the semester, having tested certain hypotheses they made about their future as a writer or a physicist or whatever it is, they make certain sort of deductions, often reformulate their hypotheses. As a professor, I'm often seeing those students right at those moments of those kind of nodes in their experimentation where they sort of are kind of wondering what those results meant and making new hypotheses and kind of projecting themselves into the future. And that's kind of how creators change the world through experimentation. And we create labs to curate experimentation, and these labs have different forms and different sort of methods depending upon the nature of experimentation, the goals that we have. So we have design labs and molecular biology labs and cinema labs. Over the last 50 years, there's been an incredible growth in the investment in labs. Sort of a defining feature of the contemporary epoch is that we invest, as many of you know, between 1 and 3% of gross domestic product in the developed world in a certain kind of lab, a science lab, which is an incredible bet on what is fundamentally an open-ended process of experimentation. And we do so because over the last 50 years we've developed this really interesting translational lab model where experimentation quickly moves to production, and a particular kind of production, often commercial and military production. As a scientist here at Harvard University and having been involved in technology for the last 15 years, a couple things sort of strike me about the limits of the current model of innovation, which has sort of changed the world around us in many obvious ways. One is that as a creator, I'm very limited to the kinds of ideas that I can develop in a science lab. And two, the nature of my dialogue with the public is very limited, and it's limited to my peers. And so when I publish, which is the principal mode of communication in a science lab, my publications are reviewed by a very small group of people, often whom I know and who give me feedback, which is high quality. It works. It's very effective as a way of developing my idea, but nevertheless gives me a limited dialogue with the public, and the public generally has a limited understanding of the innovation that's happening, and so the world is sort of changing around us with relatively little buy-in publicly, and so there's all kinds of consequences to that. And so that's one of the negatives, both from a political, social, even environmental perspective, but even from a scientist, creator point of view, the degree of dialogue, even understanding how relevant my work is to sort of the aspirations of the planet is very limited. So I've been interested in a new kind of lab, which is described in the book, a kind of art and design lab, which has many elements in common with the Bauhaus of 100 years ago, in which experimentation is artistic and design, but at frontiers of science, and where the value of experimentation is sort of threefold. There's an educational value, there's a cultural value, and there's a commercial or humanitarian value. So if you look at Silicon Valley, or if you look at even Broadway, these creative environments, sort of translational environments, have these three main value centers. And so you have sort of Stanford University, where experimentation is happening, technology experimentation, and we're learning. And so these are open-ended ideas often, and we don't really know whether they'll be useful technologically, but they're sort of educationally valuable. We've got an environment in Silicon Valley where those ideas can sort of pop into a cultural setting, which is the startup setting, where nobody's making money. So there's this sort of thing that's going on, which is sort of culturally valuable, and those who really understand the culture of Silicon Valley can sort of see startups and sort of understand that that's like a really high quality startup, even though they're not making money, but there's sort of a cultural understanding of the experimentation and the value of experimentation. And so culture, as described in the book, is this experimentation like what we see in Silicon Valley, or frankly in Off-Broadway, where I can be seeing uh, performance, and sort of, if I am appreciating the culture of Broadway, can identify the stars and sort of the promise, even though people are falling on the stage and so forth. So there's a sort of culture which is connected to the experimentation, which then leads to a kind of a potential production, which may be an IBM or a Broadway or some sort of an outcome that typically exists in a very creative environment like Silicon Valley or Broadway. And so I'm interested in this, in a new kind of innovation environment where experimentation is artistic and design and has these three centers: education, culture, and production. And why? So the whole point of the lab is to offer a new, the book is to offer a new vision of a new kind of innovation environment where A, dialogue with the public is much broader. Incubation is occurring not through peer-reviewed publication as it does in the science lab, but rather through cultural exhibition. And where outcomes of our creative work is not exclusively industrial, but is also humanitarian and cultural and educational. And I'm interested in this environment as a sustainable innovation environment, and the possibility of that being viral and having a similar kind of impact potentially as the science lab has had today, and with ramifications to education at Harvard University or in our public schools, to museum or cultural institutions, and ultimately to commercial practice and humanitarian innovation. And so that's the context of the book. The book is using lots of stories. Many of them are related to students here at Harvard University, so the whole origin of the lab is at Harvard University, and I wrote a book a couple years ago, Art Science, which sort of describes the origins of the lab, and is anchored in this concept of many of us in Harvard University environment, or it could be in a Louvre environment, who are creating value in the environment, are not sort of finding the value drivers in the institution for the creative work that they're doing. They're celebrated for their creation, but not really encouraged for the kind of creative work that they do. And so the lab evolved through this reflection here at Harvard University, and you'll find in the book the story told through the lives of creators, many of them here at Harvard University. Stories are given related to ideas that move from these educational environments through these cultural environments to commercial environments. And one of the stories that I talk a lot about is the whiff, which is a way of breathing food. And just a couple words about that before I read a little bit, and then be happy to take some questions. The whiff began as just an illustration of the kind of ideas that move through this environment. So this is not an environment for ideas that actually percolate very effectively in existing innovation environments, but for rather wild ideas like the idea of breathing food, which came up in the context of a lunch with a French chef, and being a wild idea but seemed to be interesting, gave it to some Harvard students to think about. And of course, this is precisely the kind of idea I could not have sort of asked a student, a graduate student, to work on encouraged my faculty members to be on a committee for the idea of breathing food and what is the point of breathing food. But it just seemed to be an interesting sort of experiment to do. And so students at Harvard began to whiff pepper and all kinds of nasty things. And eventually we came on the idea of whiffing chocolate and designed a kind of an inhaler to do that, and did a exhibition in Paris with the French chef. And for a couple years, the idea sort of percolated in all kinds of artistic environments as this sort of artistic experiment, and there was no obvious utilitarian application of breathing chocolate. Today, the idea is the basis of a company that's started up in London, and with major markets in energy and vitamins and other things. But it began in a very open-ended, sort of artistic, educational experimentation context, where we would have been fine had the idea not moved any further than it did in the exhibition in Paris, or in the presentation of a final project in my class. And so it is a fascinating environment for exploring wild ideas that can be commercially, humanitarian, in a humanitarian context or cultural context, high impact, and yet driving education and cultural experimentation at the same time. So just maybe a couple paragraphs to give you a sense of the idea. So I'll just read the first page, which sort of provides the context. Dreaming compels the passion of children and visionaries alike. It is what allows us at a young age to imagine the long years of schooling and apprenticeship that lie ahead, without abandoning the optimism and curiosity of childhood. It is also what allows us to pursue ideas that no one else dares imagine in the face of convention, institutional rigidity, and doubt. To dream is to believe in the possibility of experimentation. If we dream about swimming a great distance, we are not perfectly certain we can swim so far, not sure what obstacles we will face or how we will surmount them. But we do believe in the possibility of the experiment. Nature, the lake, the pool, the rushing river, becomes our lab, our place of experimentation. Labs obviously come in various kinds: film labs, design labs, molecular biology labs. We do experiments in labs that aim at outcomes, which we call discoveries. We can't say with certainty what these discoveries will be, nor can we determine when we'll achieve them, but we can imagine that film labs will mostly make discoveries of relevance to films, design labs to design, and molecular biology labs to molecular biology. This possibility of discovery encourages investment by creators wishing to sustain dreams, by labs aiming to sustain creators, and by supporters of labs hoping to sustain innovation in a world that is constantly in flux. This book is about a special kind of lab where creators and society meet through cultural exhibition, a new platform for innovation. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer any questions. My course is called today How to Create Things and Have Them Matter. And so it's a course in Engineering and Applied Science, ES20. The course has evolved over time. When I first came to Harvard in 2001, it was focused mostly on biomedical innovation, which is more of my background. It has evolved in the context of Harvard University to broadly reach out to concentration from literature to physics. I've focused now really only on undergraduates, and for the last several years, the course has been broadly developing ideas in design and arts, but at frontiers of science. It's taught in the winter and spring now, and I now co-teach it with Rob Howe. I should also point out that there's a number of both at Harvard University and outside of the university funding organizations. Part of this kind of learning is to bet on student dreams, and so at the end of the semester, students can receive funding to go around the world and learn through carrying their ideas forward, and has led to various not-for-profits and for-profits around the world. So I think one of the, sort of riffing off of your question, one of the challenges at Harvard University and even more broadly is in a world where information is no longer the primary value driver of a university. My students come to class completely not believing that I'm the filter of information they need to kind of chart their future. The question is, what is a university about? And I think we're mostly coming around to the belief that our role is to help, among other things, students imagine their future careers, and so I really have no clue if you wish to be a chemical engineer, really what a chemical engineer will be, or frankly whether even chemical engineering will exist in the future. And so this importance of teaching students to teach themselves through the realization of dreams, and that's the kind of thing we're experimenting with. And as you can imagine, once you move down that path, the question is, does the education end at the end of the semester? Does it end in 4 years, and does it stop at the limits of the campus? And so it's a exciting and sort of fascinating time in higher education. Well, the more empty they are, the fewer books that are around, the better. And so these are uh, classes where sort of the goal is for me to be sitting where you're sitting as soon as possible, and for you to be up here kind of saying, telling me about your dream as soon as possible. And so indeed, when we first began to think about lab environments and the kinds of things we needed in a lab environment, we thought about all kinds of things like sinks and kind of blocks and balls. But in fact, all of that is sort of a stumbling block to just the imagination. And so we tend to look for environments that are sort of surprising and are breaking the mold. And so when we do at the end of the semester in our class final presentations, we sometimes do it in the Loeb Theater, and students are kind of awkwardly on a theater stage, and so the more so the environment does matter, but they tend to be more black box kind of environments than this kind of an environment. We're in a age today where institutional models, from educational institutions like Harvard University to cultural institutions like the Louvre to even the, if you will, the commercial institutions, are challenged and fundamentally changing massively. So let's take each one of those. And so I have just spoken about education. Take the Louvre. So the Louvre, the Laboratoire, which is one of the organizations, so the core of our lab network that we've created is actually in Paris, the Laboratoire, and it's a cultural institution where we do exhibits of ideas of the kind I'm describing. We're right next to the Louvre, and so we work with the Louvre. And the Louvre has 8 million people who come a year. It was 5 million just a few years ago. It's really incredible. And so some statistics are pretty fascinating. 60% of the people who come to the Louvre never, it's their first visit, and it's never really changes. 85% of the people who come to the Louvre see 3 paintings, actually. Now, the Louvre is a massive organization, right? And there's all these paintings. They see 3. So if you go in the Louvre and you look at what's happening, there's just like racing through everybody's racing with their maps looking for the Mona Lisa. And so there's this, which is highly perplexing and troubling for curators at the Louvre, of course, who are wondering, well, what is our cultural mission here? And as we're opening a new Louvre, for example, in Abu Dhabi, the question is, well, what will Mona Lisa be there? Right? And so why are we doing all this if we know it's just one painting? And so there's a real issue. What the hell is culture, right? And what is our cultural mission? And how, in young people, who, if you look at how young people today not only are understanding my role as a professor, as they come in and they flip their computer open, and they're kind of Googling as I'm talking, how do young people understand culture today? Is it the curator who's sort of defining culture for in fact, just like the students sitting in my class, young people are discovering culture and understanding culture through dialogue. And so there's sort of a kind of experimentation, which is highly defined, of course, by the internet. And so a big challenge for museums right now. Museums, frankly, our cultural institutions are it's a banking system, right? And so there's an enormous value in the MFA and it's enormous value, but it's only valuable to the extent that we believe it's valuable, right? So there's a huge issue of the value of our culture and the transmission of the culture. So it's a big issue, and museums are dealing with this today, and it's reflecting in the fact the kinds of people who are coming, who's coming in. There's a huge issue. So what do you do? So, and then from a commercial point of view, there's all kinds of really challenging things. You can have a company today that has like enormous revenues whose stock is tumbling, and companies that are years away from revenues and their stock is totally going up because, in fact, the value, commercial value, is almost dependent more on your ability to convince me you can produce value tomorrow than your ability to produce value today. And so these all are breaking the models of the university. For 1,000 years has been based upon my ability to give you sort of privileged information to empower you to be a lawyer or a theologian or whatever it is. And suddenly I'm no longer the source of information, and so this whole model, right, is a big challenge. So there are debates happening all over, and the solution is not, let's sort of raise Harvard University or raise the Louvre. Clearly, there's 8 million people. Like Harvard University is very successful. So there's what's happening now. People are experimenting, and so there are lab environments that are being set up to experiment and allow us to actually explore the future, experiment with the future, and sort of coexist. So in fact, the book in terms of what is the problem, is addressing this problem, even though it's like this private lab environment. What we're looking at precisely as science labs are kind of, why are science labs sustainable? Why are we putting more and more money in it? It's not because they're kind of off in the middle of nowhere. They're delivering value, absolutely. And so the whole sustainability and relevance of the lab is its value add to institutions as they move through a very experimental phase. Voila. Yeah. So no. So yeah. So um, yeah. So if I'm going to repeat the question, so the question is, so what are the patterns? Like, where are the good ideas coming from? Are the artists or the guys who are doing it? Who's doing it? Where are the good ideas coming from? So, one of the things I say to my students in the first day of class is that my goal is to preserve the one thing that they are working very hard to eliminate, and that's their innocence, right? And so, like, people like me are spending all their life trying to be innocent by constantly doing new things and being sort of innocent. And everything in our educational system is sort of pushing you away from being innocent. But innocence is, as we all have experienced, a fabulous catalyst for innovation. So, in terms of what are the patterns, as you'll see in reading the book is pretty anecdotal. And one of the challenges, I'm going to answer your question, but I just want to sort of frame it by saying that one of the challenges in speaking of innovation and actually being credible as an innovator is that the more detailed my responses to your question, sort of the more false it is. So there's something about innovation which is very connected to serendipity. It's very connected to, you know, some would say sort of spiritual kind of Mr. B kind of flow sorts of origins. Having said that, a few patterns. Innovation often happens and great ideas often occur when people move from one culture to the next and are shocked, fearful, very curious, exactly like my students at Harvard University, right? They're like, oh my God, like, what am I going to be? I really don't know. It's like, who am I sitting next to? What class I'm in? There's all this sort of mystery that we have sort of curated modern life to take away. And so the more security we have, sort of the more successful we are in certain ways. But in reality, creative people are often looking for those shocks that throw them into a new environment where suddenly they're very, very sensitive, and often having moved from, and this is very generic, but having moved from one environment to the next, they have ideas that seem really surprising. Not very surprising to them given where they've come from. For everybody else who is sort of surprised that they're standing in their midst, it's like, wow, that's a really wild idea. So that pattern, by the way, well, it's reflected in the book and in my previous book, but it's also, if you look at Harvard University and you look at the really innovative faculty, and most faculty at Harvard University, they're all doing exactly the same thing. They're all moving across sort of disciplinary boundaries. So that's definitely a pattern. One of the things I talk a lot about in the book is the value of cultural exhibition as a catalyst for innovation. And it's something really understood in design, where we sort of talk about demo or die and the importance of kind of, it's really understood by Google. It's really understood by Google in the sense that the sort of some of the major innovation paradigms of today are driven by companies that have this opportunity to exhibit ideas well before they're sort of curated or really their value is very obvious, and throw them out there and get feedback, and throw them out there and get feedback, and that sort of value of cultural exhibition. Well, I think we've thought too much about exhibition as a public sort of service, and so kind of the old teaching method where in fact there's a really interesting catalytic thing that happens with creators as they are forced to sort of talk about their work or present their work. And so I explore that a lot, and I think that that's an interesting, it's not the proprietary product or role of artists or designers or scientists. And frankly, when it comes to creation, it's not really clear who's who. In creating, everybody sort of feels, if it's really frontier creation, everybody sort of looks to be in the same boat, which is one of the fascinating things. I talk a lot in the book, and then I'll stop riffing off of your question, but I talk a lot in the book about the really surprising value of risk sharing that happens in this sort of creative mode, where suddenly you may be the artist and I'm the scientist and you're the designer, but our boat is sinking, and if you don't fix that hole, we're all going to be sinking. I don't care if you're a scientist or not, you're going to stick your finger in the hole. And so that that actually sounds very dramatic what I'm just saying, but in fact there's something fascinating, and I need you, right? And so there's this bond that holds creators together. It doesn't really matter whether they're artists or scientists, whoever they are. And this sort of commonality of creators is a fascinating thing, and one of the big joys of creation. Is there a measurable transfer of energy at the moment of creation? Is that so? My experience, I guess, is that there, in any idea that moves on to some sort of independent existence, and so I'm kind of really personalize ideas, but ideas, if we think of ideas as dreams, and dreams that we intend to realize and that can ultimately be realized, and so ideas that are moving from a purely dream state to some realized form as a work of art or some sort of humanitarian intervention, my experience is that these ideas are sort of being recreated along the way. And so there's sort of often maybe one sort of identifiable eureka moment, which is sort of mythical, and frankly, a lot of curation of ideas is storytelling, right? So you have to go back and talk about this moment of creation, and everybody kind of feels good about it and they sort of understand it. But in fact, there's all these really interesting moments that are often middle of the night, waking up in the moment, night moments. A lot of the unsung heroes are kind of heroes at certain moments, and those are big charge moments. It gets back to this risk sharing thing. So one of the energy transfer things that's happening in this creation. So frequently, creation is not me just walking down the street and saying, it's me saying, oh my God, I have, it's like Dostoevsky, losing money, then writing this really great chapter. And so often creators are in this sort of risky kind of environment, liked being in a risky environment, and then in resolving their risk environment through creation, there's a huge release, and it's often shared, and so there is an energy transfer, and that gets back to this joy of co-creation, is that you kind of all have a drink at the end of the day. We did it. It's a great. So it's a fabulous life. It doesn't look like it from the outside, but it's a fabulous life. So there is this energy transfer. Yes. Is that your question was? Am I arguing for more risk in science? I'm arguing for a number of things. I guess I think the science model works really well, and I'm part of that and have been part of that. And I think that it's an amazing, transformative idea development environment, the science lab. I think a couple of the big issues with science labs, as I've lived them at least, are there's not enough dialogue, and so we're limited. I can't get up here and dance as a scientist, and there's a certain format. There's artists who actually do works of art, which is sort of mimicking what scientists do. We're really limited to kind of what we can do, what we can say. We're always right. Right? Every time we publish, we're always right. We never write an artist. So, I had this idea, but it was really wrong. It was bad, and that's published in Nature. It doesn't happen. So we're always there's all these kind of rules, which are really pretty constraining. It works, but I think that it can be broadened. So I think the dialogue thing with the public is both a detriment to the scientists and it's a detriment. So risk taking for risk taking, I'm not so much saying that, although I am saying that I think if you look at the really fascinating scientists who are doing fascinating, groundbreaking work, they are taking big risks and they feel like artists actually. And so there's actually, if you look at what's going on in those labs, it's very much like what's going on in a very successful art studio actually. And so the book is not about the failure of the science lab model at all. It's about the potential of a complementary lab model, completely complementary, which has other pros and cons. There's lots of things that this kind of an environment can't do. But as a complement, it's, I think, interesting. So, yeah, so in fact, that's the whole concept of failure is really interesting. And so, in a way it does, and in a way it doesn't. So, as an innovator, I think, or as a creator, and certainly the stories that are described here, you sort of always win. Now, the reality is, if you look at it, I try to be honest in this book, that in fact you're failing constantly, 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 but you're always sort of learning, right? And so you, creators, scientists, whoever we are these indefatigable, right, optimists, right? And so they're constantly, not that they don't feel really depressed sometimes, if really disappointed and kind of, but that depression and disappointment is often the catalyst for this kind of energy transfer eureka moment. So it's kind of a very rough life, but it's also addictive. And so, do I talk about failure? I do. But I talk more about the important role of failure in success. Let me ask. So in order. So the role of public dialogue as described in this book is more connected to kind of, as I call them, nodes of the idea translation process, these moments where a creator is looking to obtain feedback and kind of communicate meaningful moments of a creative process. It's sort of very vague. It's publication sort of. And so there is a lot of openness in what we do. There's also a lot of intimacy in what we do. So this is definitely not, what I'm describing is definitely not this sort of open source kind of everybody sort of contributing kind of thing at all. In fact, it's very personal, very, I think creativity, at least as I understand it, is a very personal kind of thing, which is often shared. And what I describe in terms of the public dialogue is much more of a sort of a funnel thing that's going on, where it's sort of like the writer who has an idea, shares it with a mate, sort of criticized, and then it's the agent, and then it's a little bit better, and then it's the editor, it's a little bit better, and then it's the critics, a little bit better, and there's this sort of growing network of people who are more and more involved. But I think that creators, if you just think forever, have worked by small environments where they're getting feedback, but they're not getting kicked in the knee. And then once it's a little bit more mature, the broader environment. So that's more what's talked about. So I don't think it's so much this open source thing as it is it's a different kind of public dialogue. In terms of other institutions, so I think what I'm going to describe here is characteristic of the creation that's going on in most of my colleagues' labs here at Harvard University or at MIT, where I was before. I think that today, for better and for worse, we're in a much more open world. And so our ideas, as they move from one environment to the next and go into exhibition environments, could just as well go to Singapore and then go to South Korea and then go to, and so the relevance of a neighboring is not nearly as great as it once was. And so because I travel a lot and so forth, so I do interact, and we do interact. We work a lot with, in fact, the woman who's sitting next to you with her two little children here is actually leading a big effort that we do with the Boston Public Schools. So we do a lot with Boston Public Schools, with the MFA, with the Science Museum, and so forth, in generalizing what we do to high school students, inner city high school students. So we are engaged locally that way. But for any one of our ideas, I think that partners. And another thing which described a lot in the book, which is a reality of idea development, is that these ideas are moving to very different environments, and it could be the MFA, but it could also be the Louvre. It could be some, Dahran, where we have a project work, and so today, there's a much bigger geographical scope, basically. But clearly, the Media Lab at MIT is a historical cornerstone in a lot of the kind of experimentation that we're just, and I talk about the Media Lab in the book. Ike. Well, yeah. So it is. Here's the deal, Ike. For me, the I think that for the Beatles, as the music group, as opposed to the little bugs running around us, the sustainability and, in fact, the virality of the Beatles as a cultural phenomenon was related to their economic sustainability. And so at the end of the day, and as somebody who's kind of, you got to pay the bills, right? So and I kind of explore that, and this is completely an experiment, and so I think that so I'm fascinated with the coexistence of creation and value in commercial, humanitarian, cultural, and educational environments. I think all those belong together. I think that if you look at really, really viral ideas, they move in all of those ways. I think that our institutions keep them too much. And if you look at innovators, they're interested in all those things. So Bill Gates, like commercial, but then he's like really interested in humanitarian stuff. He's really interested in education. He's like doing all these things. That's typical. We're human. Of course, we're interested in all those things. And so I think that all those things, belong together. Money is a kind of a dirty thing in a way, but it's fundamentally necessary, right? And so I think the hope is that the lab is sustainable, and the equal hope is that the impact is much broader than a purely commercial impact. And I should also, just before I end with that utopian note, say that if you look at what's happening in the NGO space, in the environment, or in global health, for example, people are not where they were 10 years ago, right? There's a much better recognition that, the idea of this handout, I'll give you money, you go do something important, I'll give you some more money. It works in some cases, but in cases particularly where you're creating value, it's not working very well. And so people are totally looking at these mixed models, which I think is very positive and hopeful, personally. Utopian, you've got to dream, right? We're in a very non-utopian world, and so somebody's got to be dreaming. And frankly, all these young people here are dreaming, right? That's why do I come back and teach on every? They are still dreaming, right? We're totally screwing things up, but they're still dreaming, and that's I think that they need an environment to realize those dreams. I think the value of experimentation with chocolate inhalers, the cultural value is inherent in the value of that experimentation for that experimentation's sake. And I think that had we, with the students or in our cultural exhibition, been saying, and then we're going to make a bucket load of money because people are going to really want to, it would have been educationally very uninteresting and culturally really, really uninteresting. So I think if you look at, and there's a lot of really popular examples today, like Facebook or Google, where you see that early on, even though people probably were much more understand it, there's a lot of experimentation going on. People were not sort of asking, are we making money? Or it was just like, oh my gosh, look at it, this is really taking on. So there is a point where, and right now, the fact that breathing energy kind of caffeine gets into your bloodstream more faster, and so it's like a faster acting sort of Red Bull, and that it can make money and go back and sort of fund the cause is really interesting, right? But that's not why we developed it. And so I think that's what allows this. And equally, we talk in this book about works of art that are purchased by major museums and so forth. So I don't want to totally focus on breathable chocolate, but as an illustration, I think what I'm driving at is that our ability to pursue really breakthrough ideas, whatever they are, is enhanced by a model where each little experiment is sort of valuable in and of itself. And I don't need to sort of ask the kid whether, well, do I really think that's going to be a reality? I don't really care. You know, if you're learning, that's great, and people are sort of experimenting. So that's the it's sort of a subtlety. But just to terminate, to finish on that point, if you look at great writers, you look at great physicists or who are involved in creating major works of culture, I think that they love, in a often masochistic way, but I think that they love every second of the process, and often are depressed at the work, right? It's like, oh my, and so there's this, and so what I'm interested here in the lab is inviting the public into that reality, right? I don't think we're all living in a lab, right? And it's all, the world is constantly changing. There's a certain joy of it in every single second, which is really known by creators. It's not very understood more broadly, but that is the distinction. The core of what we have been doing has used a couple key methods. One method in education, which is we seed groups of students. So we group students together early on in a semester. We seed those groups with big ideas. So, well, why do you seed with joy? Just think of your own idea. If you look at how creators are created, basically, they tend to have mentor environments. Certainly true in a science lab. You come into my lab, I'm not going to just do whatever you want to do and just come to. I will pretty much give you some orientation. I'm counting on you figuring out your own orientation, but I'm sort of helping you understand what matters. So my course, how to create things that have the matter. Being passionate is one thing, so we do a lot to try and encourage a kid's passion, and we can come back to that. But the association with what you care about, with what matters in the world, is actually, it seems like a trivial thing, but it's actually, it took me 30-something years to kind of figure out that what's going on in my head could really, really matter, and to kind of make that sort of bet. And so we, right away, encourage kids, and they go through this frustrating thing, which is a group thing. Dreaming as a group is really painful. And associating your passion with something that really matters is really painful. And so we do that. We do a lot of brainstorming. So having kind of gone through this process myself, we don't really do some mind mapping and other kinds of things that are probably very effective, but I don't really know any creators who've really been like super successful in kind of following rules. And so it tends to be a pretty dirty kind of, in a positive way, but kind of chaotic thing. So most of what we do to enhance passion is to work hard on the correlation between student passion and an idea that matters. That's kind of if we can get a third way or halfway through the semester and kind of made that connection, that's a big deal. And then there's a lot of exhibition where we're getting students up and up and up, where they then are getting feedback. So in terms of the public, we have not done a big effort so there's different publics, as I was explaining before. There's this intimate public, and then there are kind of broader and broader publics. I kind of feel as if those initial publics in my class or at the laboratoire who are seeing early stage ideas should be intimate publics. And so we don't do much to kind of get a big public involved. It's sort of whoever dares enter kind of thing. It's like the off-Broadway thing. You don't want the broad public coming in. You sort of want to keep this sort of intimate. We have an exhibition going on right now related to edible bottles, and it's totally fun. And the idea that clearly, eventually, bottles will be like oranges and bananas, and you'll sort of peel it off and you'll eat it. That's clearly where we're going. And so we're experimenting, and everybody who's come has really been successful. But then we were on TV a few weeks ago, and they brought 10 people off the street, and they were just like completely outraged. So it feels really weird, and it looks totally really strange, and it tastes really weird. And there's all this kind of reaction. And so clearly in the early stage of idea development, there's kind of a confidence thing. You just need intimate. So that issue of who is a public and how do you sort of invite them in, we're learning about how to do that. Well, thank you very much, and enjoy the evening. Thank you.